Здравствуйте, товарищи, and welcome to another one of our coffee house videos. And in this video we're going to continue our journey through the wonderful world of ethical philosophy. And in the last video we talked about how the sort of Ten Commandments, divine command theory, the whole idea that our morality is derived from some supernatural being is not a viable ethical moral theory. And some people tried to argue against that, but no one could ultimately resolve the sort of questions raised up by the Utilitarian question. Some guy tried to circumnavigate the questions entirely, and he was like, well, honesty is right because God is honest. And, that's not good enough. We need to figure out why honesty is right, and then build a foundation for an ethical theory based on, why certain moral actions are right and why certain moral actions are wrong, rather than just considering that they are just assuming that they are the right or wrong choice. And that's what these two ethical theories that I'm going to talk about today do. And there's a lot of stuff to cover, but not much time to get through them. But basically, sort of after these attacks on divine command theory, that left a big void, and into this void step two major moral theories, which are still the two biggest, in ethical philosophy today. They sort of originated in the middle of the 19th century, and then kind of went away in the middle of the 20th century, but then in the 1970s and 80s, they came roaring back and were like, haha, we knew you'd need us, we knew you couldn't think of anything better. But anyway, these two philosophies are Utilitarianism and Kantism. Anyway, I'm going to start this discussion by asking a question. And that question is there ever any grounds where you could morally justify killing somebody? And if you said, no, there's no way, killing is always wrong no matter what the situation is, you would definitely fall into the Kantian sect of moral philosophy. But if you said, well, if there's this situation or that situation, then yeah, we could probably, justify killing somebody. If that were the case, you'd probably fall into the utilitarian ethical philosophy camp. And I'm going to talk about them first. And utilitarianism sounds really complex, but it's not really. Basically, the object of a utilitarian is to create a moral situation that maximizes the amount of good, and the way you maximize the amount of good is you maximize the amount of pleasure or happiness, and those two are interchangeable. So let's take a situation where you're standing on top of a bridge, and in front of you is this big guy, and below you there's a train track, and there's a train coming, but it's going to go off into a chasm, and let's say there's 500 people on this train. And this guy that's sitting in front of you, he has enough weight that if you push him in front of the train tracks, he'll be able to stop the train and save everybody on them from going over the chasm and inevitably dying. But thus sacrificing the one man. So essentially you're sacrificing one man to save 500 people. And from a utilitarian standpoint, sacrificing the one man would be the absolute way to go, because if you've saved the 500 people, you've created much more, you've maximized the amount of happiness in the world, and all this happiness that these people will feel from, then from the point they were saved on the train onward, and, therefore we should sacrifice that one person. And for a utilitarian, there's kind of a bunch of different ways you can calculate pleasure, and, they come in things like quantity, fruitfulness, likelihood, duration, and then there's kind of a split in the utilitarian philosophers of whether or not the quality of the pleasure matters. And the two guys who came up with utilitarianism were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And we've talked about John Stuart Mill before. He was really instrumental in the fundamental ideas of liberalism. But basically Bentham said that the type of pleasure doesn't matter. That if you get as much pleasure from reading poetry as you do as getting drunk and partying every night, they're both the morally right ways to go. John Stuart Mill, however, says no, the quality does matter, And intellectual pleasures are better than kind of physical pleasures. And his argument for that was that if you were an uneducated person and you became educated, you would never ever want to return to the point where you were uneducated. I've got a quote for him here, and he says, "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." And that kind of sums up his position quite elegantly. And I kind of fall into the John Stuart Mill camp, and most philosophers seem to do so as well, mainly because that does give us like a moral justification for things like public education, that if we give everybody this education, they're going to get a better quality of educational pleasures, therefore that we're going to maximize the amount of happiness in the world, and therefore we're going to maximize the amount of good. So, for a utilitarian, it's all about the consequences, and the consequences of your actions are really all that matters. So the right action, as I said before, is the one that maximizes the amount of happiness. But there are a couple problems with this theory. Mainly, is that all that goodness really is? Is it just happiness? So essentially, from a utilitarian model, that if we just kind of invented a pill that gave us pleasure, and we distributed these pills to everyone, and they were constantly taking them and always feeling happy, we would essentially have the most moral society in the world. Also, utilitarianism is really good at devising calculations for these really big, epic scenarios. Like, do we save, the 500 people at the expense of one man? That's easy for a utilitarian to decide. But when you get into smaller scale, that's much more difficult. I always got this picture of like the utilitarian philosopher. He's at the corner store and he's examining a Snickers bar and a Mars bar, and he's looking at both of them, having this internal moral battle of which one he's going to buy and which one's going to maximize the amount of pleasure for him. He's like looking at the Mars bar and goes, I think the Mars bar is a little bit more hefty than the Snickers bar, but the Snickers bar does have nuts in it. And he's just laboring over this, which one he's going to do. Also, utilitarianism doesn't take into account personal relationships. So let's say there's a fire going on, and in this fire, your son and the guy who's going to cure cancer is going to burn to death. And according to a utilitarian model, you would have to save the guy who's going to cure cancer, because he's going to save all these people and thereby maximize the amount of happiness in the world. And maybe your son was a great kid, but he's not going to cure cancer. And finally, utilitarianism is essentially really demanding of us, because we could always take an action that would maximize the amount of good more than the action that we did. So let's say we sold all our stuff and gave all our money to starving African children, and created the most ultimate scenario that would maximize the amount of happiness in the world. Utilitarians would say, well, you probably should have done that anyway, because that was the morally right action, whereas most kind of ethical theories would see this as a moral triumph. So that's utilitarianism. Trying to give you a brief outline of what it is and what the strengths and weaknesses of it are. But let's move into Kantianism. And Kantianism is interesting. I kind of like Kantianism, and at the same time I really despise it. So for a Kantian, the consequences don't matter at all. It's just the principle of your actions that matter. And I don't think Kant would look at it this way, but you could look at it this way. Essentially, he's taking the absolute values of, say, something like the Bible, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on and so forth, and finding a non-religious justification for why those are the morally right answers. And the way we do that is through universalization. So let's take the concept of lying and say, okay, if you lie, then what happens if we universalize this so that we create a world where everybody lies? So in a world where everybody lies, then the concept of truth would cease to exist, and therefore the concept of lying would cease to exist. So therefore, if you lie, essentially what you're saying is that truth doesn't exist, and therefore lying doesn't exist, and that creates a paradox that will cause our minds to explode. Therefore, you shouldn't lie. So if you're going to take an action that, if we universalize it, would essentially mean the ceasing of such a principle, then we shouldn't do it. If we take murder, for example, if everybody murdered, then the concept of life would cease to exist, and therefore the concept of murder would cease to exist, therefore we shouldn't murder. To quote Kant himself, he said, "You should safely act in a manner that could, or so you should act in a manner that could safely be made law for the entire world. And there are a couple problems to Kantianism as well. First off, I don't think anybody is going to look at a moral situation and say, if we universalize this, and then this concept ceases to exist, and this concept ceases to exist, therefore we shouldn't do it. I don't think anybody looks at moral situations in that manner. Also, from a Kantian perspective, the consequences don't matter. And I think the consequences do matter. And he kind of vastly underestimates our ability to influence the consequences of our actions, and I think that's the wrong standpoint to take. And finally, you can use Kantianism to really justify some weird things. Like, let's take being gay, for example. So if everybody were gay, then the concept of straightness would cease to exist. Therefore, the concept of gayness would cease to exist. Therefore, you shouldn't be gay. And I'm sure most people are thinking, well, that's kind of silly, that's kind of wrong. But I'm sure there are also other people out there thinking, finally, you've given me a non-religious justification for why being gay is morally wrong. But I think most of us are in the camp that that's kind of weird. But anyway, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to briefly sum up where I come in a standpoint. Basically, I am more of a utilitarian than I am a Kantian. I think that the consequences of our actions really do matter. And, when I was first reading Kant, I felt like he really had something, but I kind of got off that train when he said, nope, consequences don't matter. And I feel that, people kind of act in a utilitarian manner anyway, that they're going to try and devise a scenario that maximizes the amount of good for the most amount of people. And most people will say that this is a weakness of utilitarianism, is that every action you do has to undergo some kind of scrutiny, has to undergo some kind of calculation of what you think the consequences of your action are, and which consequence is going to lead to the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. But I think that's a strength, because that means there's no such thing as an impulsive utilitarian. And if we scrutinize our decisions and examine all the possible factors that would go into it, I feel that we make better decisions. And that's essentially why I'm a utilitarian. But I've only got 15 minutes, and there's just so much more stuff about these moral theories that I could just go on and on and on and on and on and do a huge segment on each of them. But anyway, I think I'm going to call it quits for now, because my camera is yelling at me that we're running out of time. So I hope you learned something about these two really big players in ethical philosophy. I'm going to have one more video about ethical philosophy. We're going to talk about subjectivism. And I noticed that a lot of people were making subjectivist comments, if you will, in my last video, saying that, I don't think there's anything, a real moral theory. I think, we all just kind of made it up. Ethics is based on an individual basis. And that's really what subjectivism is. And we'll talk about that later. Also might go into a little bit of Nietzsche. Alright, sorry we got cut off there. Basically, we'll probably talk about everybody's favorite German philosopher. Maybe throw in some other philosophers in there for good measure. And then try and give you as much information as I can in, collectively 45 minutes. So maybe you can read a little bit more on ethical philosophy, or decide, which one of these guys sounds like they're the right, they got it right, that they got the best theory on ethics. So, with that being said, I'm going to sign off for now. This has been Joseph Stalin,